Good morning and welcome to ECFR European Parliament Election Insights. My name is Susi Dennison. I'm a senior fellow at ECFR and I'm delighted to be chairing this discussion this morning. So first, a few words about where we are from a pan-European perspective. Well, last night was a good night for the far right in the European Parliament elections. We saw the Identity and Democracy Party increase their number of seats in the European Parliament, not by as much as was expected, but still by 9. We saw the European Conservative and Reformists increase their share, again, not by as much as was expected, but by 4. But there are now 36 non-aligned, non-inscrit seats in the European Parliament, 15 of which are for the AfD in Germany. And we also saw on a national level, the far right come in strongly in many different locations. It was also actually a good night for the European People's Party. They went up by 8 seats overall. And as Ursula von der Leyen was arguing last night, this shows that the centre is holding in the EU context. And actually, also, it wasn't a bad night looking Europe-wide for the Socialists and Democrats, whose overall vote share has not gone down. However, the losers of this election, looking from an EU-wide perspective, seem to be exactly the 2 groups that in 2019 did significantly well. Renew has gone down by 22 seats and the Greens down by 19 seats, given where the vote assessments are currently. And so it looks for both of these political groups much more difficult to be pushing their agendas forward. But obviously behind this pan-European story, there are many different national stories, and we're going to be delving into 4 of them this morning, and then thinking through what this means for a collective European foreign policy with the new look Europe that we're waking up to this morning. We can see that some national leaders of member states are going to be feeling quite bruised in Germany, in France, in Spain. Some national leaders in other big member states, such as Italy, are going to be feeling emboldened by this picture. So I'm going to be talking to my colleagues from 4 different EU national offices, and we're very grateful that they have taken the time to come and join us, where many of them have been on television platforms most of the night. We have an all-star cast from Paris. We have the head of our ECFR office, Celia Belin. From Berlin, we have policy fellow Rafael. From Sofia, in fact, she's not in Sofia, but the head of our Sofia office, we have Maria Simeonova, and we have the head of our Rome office, Arturo Varvelli, able to talk to us this morning. So first of all, I'm just going to go to each of you and ask you for your big takeaway from last night's results. And Celia, I've got to come to you first, because overnight we obviously saw what was a European discussion turn into a national psychodrama in France. So tell us how the situation looks from Paris this morning.
Well, I'm actually not in Paris as well. I am in Strasbourg, where the mood is similar to what I imagined it is in Paris, which is what happened yesterday night was a political earthquake of real big proportion. It's not actually so much about the very high score of the national rally, because this has been anticipated by pollsters now for the past few weeks or months, where the national rally ends up with twice as many votes and probably as many seats as Emmanuel Macron's majority Renaissance list, which has largely failed in its capacity to mobilize, has gone down significantly from 2019, and is also very close to the Socialist party that were led by Rafael Glucksmann, who has been able to sort of create this ecological social movement that ends up right behind Macron, but both of them very, very, very far from the national rally that is topping 32 33 percentage points. But that was sort of planned. Everybody was sort of anticipating, and people were already discussing the effect on Macron's foreign policy, the effect on Macron's national politics. The real surprise came less than an hour after the results, when President Macron announced that he was dissolving the National Assembly, sending everyone to a snap elections in less than, what is it, 3 weeks or 4 weeks, for 3 weeks for the first round and 4 weeks for the second. And you have to imagine that in a French context, this is a massive surprise. Snap elections are not common at all. The last one, I believe, was in 1895. And usually are actually lost by the president that calls for these elections. And they are not in the French political culture. They seem to be answering directly to Jordan Bardella, the head of the National Rally, who was asking for them, even though President Macron makes the case that that's the only way for him to go forward, and for the majority, or his party and the non-nationalists to go forward. But this morning, listening to French radio, everybody is extremely jittery. Everybody is extremely confused, including member of parliaments and their teams and everyone that has to put in place these elections in just a matter of a few weeks. And I think at the minimum, we can say this is massively unsettling and totally surprising, and with absolute unknown consequences. Maybe we can go back and discuss them later.
Thanks very much. Yes, I think it'll be good to discuss what France being now focused on national elections means for the way that Paris is going to be able to engage in the European context in the next few weeks. Let's go then to Berlin. Rafael, if I could turn to you. We saw in Berlin, in Germany, sorry, almost sort of the opposite of the French result, in terms of the AfD coming in very strongly in second place with a sort of similar result to what Macron's party managed to achieve in France for the AfD. But talk us through sort of how this looks this morning and what you're hearing in terms of how the leadership in Germany are thinking about these results.
Right, yeah. So I think we saw a significant defeat of the traffic light coalition. Collectively, the three parties, the Social Democrats, Greens, and Liberals, compared to the 2019 European Parliament elections, lost about 11 percentage points. Compared to the last federal level election, the Bundestag elections in 2021, they've lost a whopping 24 percentage points. So this is a significant decline for those three governing parties. We also saw not only the rise, but the normalization of the far-right AfD. They've gotten 16% of the vote share, are now the second strongest part of the German delegation to the European Parliament after the center-right CDU, especially concerning looking ahead into the autumn when we have elections in three Länder, in 3 states in East Germany. The AfD came in strongest in all 3 of them. These elections will take place in September, and I think for all pro-European, pro-democratic parties, this will raise headaches for how to internalize the European Parliament results and to make their way into the autumn elections. And then next year in autumn 2025, of course, we have the next federal level elections in Germany for the Bundestag. Nevertheless, the center-right doesn't appear as an obvious alternative. The CDU has barely increased their vote share by 1 percentage point compared to the 2019 European Parliament elections. Compared to the Bundestag election 2021, they've even lost a couple of percentage points, 0.4 percentage points, in fact. And their leader, Friedrich Merz, is even less liked by German voters than Olaf Scholz, Germany's chancellor. So it's a head-to-head race to the bottom of favorability ratings. And that means that both parties, the SPD and the CDU, struggle with some internal divisions about who do they elect, who do they put forward as their lead candidate for the German parliamentary elections in autumn next year. Both of them have folks in their ranks which are more liked. On the SPD side, the defense minister, Boris Pistorius, is Germany's most liked politician, and even the CDU has some state-level leaders that have higher favorability ratings than Friedrich Merz does. So it's a complicating picture. The parties are struggling to make something out of the results. They attach themselves to different reference points to make it seem not too bleak, but it is a pretty bleak result for the pro-European democratic mainstream in Germany.
Thank you, Rafael. Okay, so let's then go to Rome, Arturo, if we could, where I think in the corridors of power in the government there'll be a slightly different feeling given the results for Meloni's party this morning.
Yes, Susi, but I think Giorgia Meloni is the clear winner of the European election in Italy, because after 2 years of government, Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy, is firmly the first party, now is around 28%. And Meloni arrives at the G7, because next week there is the main summit in Italy. And she arrives at the negotiation for the Commission in a strong position compared to its European colleagues, Macron and Scholz, for example. So, and in the next few weeks, I think Meloni will be able to play, if she wants to play this role, a decisive role in shaping the new arrangements in Brussels. At the same time, Forza Italia, that is part of the European Popular Party, straightens at the expense of Salvini's Lega and the centries of the Renew Macron area. So the Meloni government is one of the clear winners of the election, together with the European Popular Party. But Meloni will now, I believe, be forced in some way to look at the center. Although she will be very, very curious to see if Le Pen wins in France on 7 July, because this could change a lot of things also for Italy, also for the Meloni positioning. The Democratic Party by Ellis Lane passes her first major election test. The Democratic Party has improved its numbers since the general election 2 years ago. The five-star movement collapsed, probably due to the very low turnout in the south of Italy, because they take the votes particularly from the south of Italy. And importantly, Italy contributed to Renew collapse, because neither of the two parties in the liberal political group, in the liberal political camp, exceeded the 4% threshold. That is a small political suicide that does not help Macron at the European level. And finally, on the right, Salvini is true that avoid the collapse, because now is around 9%. But 5 years ago, Salvini was the rising star of the center-right. Today, he is the third behind Meloni and even a Forza Italia, Tajani, without Berlusconi. So this is an important political thing to analyze.
Thanks a lot, Arturo. And then Maria, if we could turn to you, in Sofia, you guys are sort of quite acquainted with elections over the last few years. It would be great to sort of hear your take, not only on the results themselves, but the extent to which this was a discussion or an expression of feeling about Bulgaria and the EU, and what to expect on the back of that.
So yeah, as you said, Susie, we're getting better and better maybe at organizing elections. Unfortunately, we marked the lowest turnout, which is slightly above 30%, but I would be cautious with this percentage, because in Bulgaria, we all know that we witnessed some irregularities in the electoral roll. Nevertheless, the European Parliament election campaign here was severely distorted by the general election taking place at the same day. This was due to the fact that there was an unsuccessful attempt for rotating prime ministers between former Prime Minister Boyko Borisov's GERB party and the reformist coalition with former Prime Minister Kirill Petkov, we continue to change democratic Bulgaria. So when this rotation experiment collapsed after 10 months of governing together, governing between big rivals in the parliament, we headed to the 6th general election in 3 years, taking place at the same time with the European Parliament elections. So, as I said, we marked the lowest turnout, which allowed for some small pro-Russian and ad hoc created political project to pass the barrier for the national parliament. The big winner, obviously, of the election is former Prime Minister Boyko Borisov's GER party, who governed the country for a little over a decade until 2021, when the political crisis started here. But nevertheless, we should clarify that the counting is still ongoing. So even though I'll mention some numbers, we should be careful because they will slightly change in the next hours. So what the surprise is that Borisov's GER party marked the biggest difference and the biggest lead to the second party, which until as of now is the reformist coalition. We continue to change democratic Bulgaria. Just to give you a background, in April 2023, the parliamentary elections, this difference was around 2%. Currently, as of now, it is like 8%. So apparently Borisov is the winner. There is a slight increase in the nationalistic votes, even though in terms of the European Parliament elections, the parties that are currently in the Parliament will be the ones sending members to the European Parliament, with Borisov having the highest number of members, followed by relatively similar numbers between the second, the third, and the fourth, who share similar results at around 15%. Here we're speaking about the pro-reformists, the Nationalist Party Revival, and the Movement for Rights and Freedoms, member of ALDE, which is a liberal party with a solid-based Turkish minority in Bulgaria.
Thanks a lot, Maria. And obviously, Maria raises an important point about the fact that there are a number of settings in which the count is not finalised. So a lot of the numbers I was using in the opening introduction should come with that caveat too. We sacrifice having absolute clarity for the sake of being able to start talking as soon as possible about what this all means for our work this morning. But I wondered if I could come back to the others of you with another point which Maria has rightly raised about turnout in these elections. From a pan-EU perspective, it looks, I believe, like that turnout overall was around 51%, so even above what we saw in the 2019 elections, which was an increase. So from that point of view, from a pan-EU perspective, one is tempted to sort of say that this is a genuine expression of the way that European voters are thinking at the moment about the European project. But I wondered if any of the others of you wanted to comment on turnout from a national point of view in terms of what you're hearing on that front.
Maybe I can say a word about that.
Great.
Yes. Turnout in France was exactly the same as the European median, 51%, and it had also increased from 2019. What we can see this morning is that turnout was higher in the regions that are traditionally considered as voting more for the far right or for Marine Le Pen's party, and so that probably explains a lot of success of the party. One of the elements I think that came out from our public opinion poll in January that was most striking to me, I think when we digged into the numbers, we saw that the types of voters that were most motivated to vote in a national context, and so in France specifically, were the nationalists, so the national rally, but also the far-right Reconquête party, when the Greens and the progressives and the socialists and the Renaissance said that they were less motivated to vote. The second, lesson from that poll was that when asked whether they believed their vote mattered and had a significant influence on the in Europe, the more nationalist you were, the more likely you were to believe that your vote mattered. And so in many ways, people on the far right of the political spectrum, or at least on the nationalist side of the political spectrum, were determined to vote, believed it mattered. And maybe that's how we've seen these enormous differences. And those who were less likely to vote and more depressed about believing in their own vote were, for example, the Greens, at least in France. And when we look at scores of the Greens in France, in Germany, it seems to have been a sort of a more general phenomenon that then translates into less seats. So I would bet that this morning a lot of people believe that their vote actually mattered, and indeed, because it has created, at least for France, a lot of ripple effects. But one of the last elements that I want to point out is that the sort of national meltdown that we're experiencing in France this morning is sort of hiding the fact that this was a European election, that this was about the future of Europe. It still is about the future of Europe. France will just need another month to get there, to get to talking about the future of Europe, even if quite a few people went ahead and voted in this particular election.
Yes, and of course, one of the understandings of the dramatic decision which Macron took overnight could be indeed that in a way this will allow France to sort of, or Macron, if his bet pays off, to come back sort of emboldened in the discussions about shaping the next phase of the European project, which looks harder this morning than it did last week. Maybe then we could come on to the question of what this means for the sort of the positioning for the top jobs in the EU institutions going forward. We've obviously got the European Council at the end of this month, where there was some expectation that perhaps a deal could be secured, perhaps von der Leyen's renewal at the head of the European Commission might be part of that deal if all went to plan. Be interesting to hear Rafael or Arturo from Berlin and Rome, sort of how that looks this morning, and what the talk is there. Bearing in mind what Arturo said, of course, about the fact that everybody will want to see what happens in the French national elections now. Rafael.
Right. Susi, I mean, going back to what you mentioned at the very beginning, the sort of centrist coalition of EPP, S&D, and Renew have lost some seats. When Ursula von der Leyen was elected to president of the European Commission in 2019, there were some detractors in that coalition who didn't vote for her. With a slimmer majority after this year's election, she might depend on other centrist pro-European parties to secure the job. And that means that paradoxically, despite their losses, the European Greens might be in a stronger political position than previously. The lead candidate for the Greens has already said in a quite sort of ambitious statement after the significant loss were reported last night, that she would be willing to pragmatically engage with Ursula von der Leyen to get her re-elected. But that puts Ursula in a difficult position, because on the one side she is inch closer to the likes of Giorgia Meloni in some instances, whose camp rejects a lot of what the Green Group stands for, and the Green Group, vice versa, is not very keen to cooperate with a far-right grouping. So that's a bit of a bind for Ursula von der Leyen to navigate.
Thanks a lot. Arturo, did you want to come in on this?
Yes.
Talking about the positioning of Giorgia Meloni in general, but particularly in the election campaign revitalized a little bit the pacifist forces in Italy. No, talking about the international positioning of the the Italian political forces, because many parties declare themselves pacifist, no? Even if declaring themselves pacifist without saying what to do to achieve this peace seems very demagogic and populist, because the League and the Five Star Movement have been explicitly pacifist and ended up being rather pro-Russian, no? Being against the sending of military supplies to Ukraine, etc. The Democratic Party too, because unfortunately proposed in the electoral list some very pacifist members of the civil society who are against military support for Ukraine. So this election does not seem to have rewarded pacifists or anti-Europeans if we look at the poor results of the League and Five Star Movement. But there is a mixed feeling, because in every political forces there are some pacifist tendencies. On the other hand, it's true that if we look at the Meloni government, I think that Meloni government need to look at the center and to Ursula von der Leyen and to the Popular Party. And Tajani is the vice president of the Popular Party. He emerged very well from this election, and I think the Italian government is supported by coalition majority. So this is very important because Meloni is the president, but is the premier, but she has not the capacity to decide without consulting with the forces that are supporting her. And on the general attitude towards Europe and towards the Ukraine, for example, that is very important. It must be said that Meloni has held a consistent position during the electoral campaign, also arguing in TV interviews that Italy must do its part to help Ukraine, which was not to be taken for granted in an election campaign and with an Italian public opinion that is generally in the peace camp, that we want to talk about war in our electoral campaign, etc. This is very important that Meloni took this position, and we have to see the general election in France, because it's very important to understand if Meloni could swing from the right to the center, and is a potential political bridge between European political party, European Popular Party, sorry, and the rights in general. So we have to see what the election in France
brings on that. Yeah, thanks a lot. Okay, well, I should say to those participating in the webinar, watching this, the floor is now open. If you want to put questions into the Q&A box, I can start to pick them up and stop hogging the floor. But while you're thinking about that, I want to come maybe to Maria. To get you to comment on what Arturo was just saying, looking at this in terms of an election result, you work a lot on the question of enlargement, and how is that sort of dossier about Ukraine support, but also support for the geopolitical expansion of the EU project, looking to you this morning in light of the results?
Well, in light of the results in Bulgaria concretely, I would like to first start with this. Bulgaria is a country supposed to be a driving force of the enlargement, especially for the countries from the Western Balkans. And this has been the case until Sofia vetoed the start of accession talks with North Macedonia in 2020, which resulted in a 2-year-long impasse in the EU enlargement policy. This does not mean that Bulgaria is anti-enlargement country, and the results show that the Euro-Atlantic pro-European majority in Bulgaria, both in the European Parliament elections and the general elections, this majority will stay, even though there is an increase of the nationalist voices who will have like the platform to fuel narratives, and they go along the lines of the peace narratives. The statement of Macron of not ruling out troops to Ukraine, for example, during the campaign was taken in a very smart way by the nationalists, and they tried to use this in both their two campaigns. For enlargement, here I think we need to talk about three important elements on European level. It's the political will that was shown by the European leaders since the start of the war in Ukraine. Here I'm talking about the June 2022 Council conclusions, December conclusions, which granted candidate status to Ukraine, Moldova, but also Bosnia and Herzegovina, unblocking the process by Bulgaria lifting its veto in June 2022 over the start of accession talks with North Macedonia. So this is one important element, the political will that was there, but then this political will, which was kind of motivated by the war in Ukraine and the realization that there's a geostrategic logic behind enlargement. This has to be complemented by internal reforms in the EU. And I think this will be the hard conversation, because here we're not only talking about qualified majority voting, where the conversation had started months before the elections, but I think with the current results, this conversation will become more and more difficult. Then we have questions like what to do with EU's cohesion policy, what to do with the common agricultural policy. And here Ukraine is an important factor in the equation, because we need to start a very serious conversation about the absorption capacity of the European Union. A third element here in the enlargement process that I would identify is the progress in the candidate member states themselves. One thing that can be done, given this current state of affairs after the elections, I think maybe some countries, for example, in Southeastern Europe, can rely or undertake an approach of regional cooperation in order to push the enlargement process to their neighboring countries, like Bulgaria, Romania, Greece. For example, have a common interest in working together in order to support the 6 countries from the Western Balkans to advance, to help them with progressing. On Montenegro, just some example I can give, which is considered to be the next EU member state, technical support that neighboring countries or the newest EU member states can provide to these countries will be crucial. The elephant in the room will be the bilateral issues there between candidate countries like the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue process, but also between candidate countries and member states such as Bulgaria, North Macedonia, Greece, Albania, and so on. And here we're going to need even stronger political will.
Great. So, sort of from your read, that this result is not a vote against continuing down the path that we've set ourselves on the enlargement front, but raising questions on the how, from the budget to the reform to the so on, which makes it more challenging. I wonder if I could put a sort of a similar question to you, Rafael, in terms of your read of this result, on what it says about European support for the deepening of the defence project within the EU. This was an issue which was actually talked about a fair amount in public opinion polling around the drivers for people thinking about voting in these elections, not our public opinion polling, but still very good public opinion polling. So I wonder if you could sort of just say how you see this as a kind of a hot reaction this morning, looking at the political landscape.
It's traditionally been a sort of national prerogative in the European Union. given that more integrationist, supranationally oriented parties have lost this election, including Greens, Liberals, S&D. I think an upgrading of certain defense ambitions that are constrained by treaty limits to begin with is difficult to foresee. There might be changes at the margins. There's been a lot of talk about a defense industry commissioner, I think, out of necessity to increase Europe's defensive capacity, defense industrial capacity. That might very well materialize, but it's difficult to foresee any more ambitious steps there. It depends very much on how the national leaderships are positioning themselves at the European Council discussions, what kinds of initiatives they put forward, and then what they identify as themes, as narratives, as political projects to use to recoup some of their loss at the polls, and defense might not be one of them. Looking at the framings, the narratives that shaped the German vote, at least it's more about change and disliking change among the populace. It's about the cost of living. It's about migration and crime, and that is not something where the European Union, through a defense activity, maybe generates the most added value. And then secondly, given that the far-right camp is divided between the sort of pro-transatlanticists and more sort of nationally or even Russian-oriented views and voices, I think there's going to be an even stronger impetus to put NATO front and center on some of the defense discussions in a lot of European countries as a result of this election.
Thanks a lot, Rafael. And maybe just sort of jumping off that reference to NATO at the end there, I wanted to come to you, Celia. I got in a number of questions from journalists from the other side of the Atlantic last night, as I'm sure you did too, about what this kind of vote in favour of a Europe of sovereign nation states, which I think is the big story that's emanating outside Europe this morning about what these elections meant. And how do you see that in terms of our ability to foster a more cohesive position towards the transatlantic relationship, towards the China relationship? You know, if we understand this, as I think Rafael put this earlier, as a vote sort of against the progressive political mainstream in many settings, what does that mean for one of the kind of the core policies which that progressive political mainstream has been pushing in the last mandate, which was the idea of a more geopolitical EU?
Oh gosh, that's an extremely difficult question, Susie. Thank you very much. There are as many nationalists as they are national contexts, is my first take, which is that, you know, we've been listening to Arturo over the past few months explaining to us Meloni's logic and thinking and approach, and I kept thinking that you know, how different this would be if it was a Marine Le Pen implementing her own foreign policy because of that context. And then, you know, you had the piece in Poland implementing yet again another sort of entirely different approach, not even talking about Orban. All of these, what it concretely means, I think, for Europe and its future is that you are less likely to have to achieve an easy consensus outside of, you know, a negative consensus where you oppose. So, you know, you might see even more opposition to climate action, even more opposition to additional sanctions against Russia, for example, or even more opposition to actually doing anything about China. But we don't see yet how this can build anything constructive in any sort of direction. And as far as Americans are concerned, they might be looking at it thinking, well, you know, these Europeans, they're divided, they're weak. But you have to realize that, you know, America is going through their own extreme political difficulties with major political swings from one side to another, with huge question mark on the future of their foreign policy, whether or not they would support Ukraine going forward, whether or not they would still have any form of climate action, and that it could go in any number of direction after November. So what's interesting in the American context is that, they sort of all agree on China as a major threat, or they all agree on industrial policy. Maybe we should make the effort to try and see what do we all agree on in Europe. And top of my head, I'm thinking as well about industrial policy. I'm thinking as well about Europe's competitiveness in the world, but maybe it's mistaken. We have many national contexts, but that could be sort of the basis of a minimal consensus in Europe. But actually, there could be an effort to try and see if support to Ukraine could still remain a minimal consensus across Europe, because I'm only talking about France, but the national rally, given the level of support for Ukraine in France, has sort of, bend its or has really tamed its pro-Russia proclivities over the years, has really focused towards Ukraine. Even if they criticize the sanctions, I think they do get a bit closer to the European middle. So maybe we will have to make the effort to try and find the minimal consensus across Europe, and that's what is going to happen in the council, in trying to find a new commission president. But big question mark. I'm still trying to imagine where it's going to land.
Yeah, I'm kind of sorry, but not sorry for having asked you a difficult question when I promised I wouldn't, because that was a great answer. So I kind of feel vindicated. Arturo, I wonder if I could turn to you, because we've got a few questions in the box about settings, national settings, where the results that we saw last night are not such a negative story for the progressive centre, if you like. Poland, where we saw Tusk's civic platform do very well. Our colleague Pavel Zek has raised the example of Spain, where although Sanchez's party was defeated, that was by Partido Popular, the conservative EPP party, and it has kind of strengthened Sanchez's Socialist Party within the S&D group. So I wondered if you could sort of comment more generally on what you expect or what you think might be possible in terms of von der Leyen's kind of framing of the centre holding, and what, how the story might evolve, that this is understood as, yes, an increase in support for the far right, but at the same time, still a likely majority when it comes to some of the big issues that kind of centrist group of EPP, S&D and Renew in the last parliament has voted on. Ukraine support, I'm thinking the EU budget here and so on, that there are still kind of ways in which the project can move forward with the results that we've seen overnight.
Yes, Susi, so another very, very difficult question from you. No, I believe I'm trying to reply to you and to the other question in the chat. I believe the question is there are an alternative idea of Europe that the right wing is elaborating or not? Or does the right simply want less Europe or to destroy the EU? I believe there is no common position in the right, but many different positions, even ones that are not very compatible, because Meloni never, for example, Meloni never talks about dismantling the European project. Now she speaks instead of a Europe of nations. It's very ambiguous, but it is in some ways an idea, On the issue of European defense, for example, because Rafael talked about this, the parties took position for or against, depending on their degrees of Europeism in Italy. In the election campaign, Meloni seems to have taken a step back from the Europeanism she had manifested recently, especially by emphasizing the return of power to the nation states towards a Europe interpreted as a sort of control room between nations or little more. No? Meloni said that the challenge for today's Europe is to regain control of its own destiny, to focus on fewer things and do them better. That is little ambiguous, but among these things to do better, there is the common defense, for example. So I think that we have to expect this kind of approach by the right in general. They can take part to the building of a new Europe, but only on few things, I think. And they want to decide this kind of things. So we have to expect probably less green energy, less green transition, more defense, because they are very conscious that this is the need for Europe. And I think that Meloni electoral campaign, for example, was quite right-wing because she did not want to leave political room, political space for the League. But this doesn't mean that Meloni is not ready to compromise, because the relation with Ursula von der Leyen was very clear. But she wants to negotiate from a position of strength, perhaps becoming the general spokesperson for the right. I think that this is the ambition. I don't think she will be able to bring the whole group of ECR to the majority, for example, because there are too many problems, because the group is divided inside. But perhaps Brother of Italy will give a support, an external support to von der Leyen, or a candidate for the Commission who can also represent the right or is not against the right, as Ursula was in the past.
Thanks a lot, Arturo. So I'm going to stop being mean to you all. We've got a question in the box about the extent to which the European Green Deal is behind and sort of the steps which have been taken so far on the European Green Deal, and what is being understood as the green lash against those measures is behind the poor performance of the Greens and Liberals in these elections. So I'm going to start off by answering that question from a pan-European perspective as I see it, but then I'd be interested, and that's my bit of not being mean, by the way, but then I'd be interested in your take on this from the different national settings that you're talking about. So I mean, it seems to me, yes, indeed, we've seen the support for green parties go down across the EU, but at the same time, I think what we have also seen is the adoption of the importance of continuing the Green Deal as a kind of a centrist party. It was quite notable that in the early comments from Nicola Schmidt, the socialist Spitzenkandidat last night, the kind of the message that the Green Deal and continuation of that remains one of the central challenges for a progressive Europe going forward. And as the question in our chat box rightly highlights, we still see the concerns about climate change as being very prevalent in terms of European public opinion at the moment. It's just not kind of one or two, which is kind of cost of living and security, but it's still very much there. The challenge from our public opinion polling at ECFR seems to be that while people support the idea of action against climate change, they're very concerned about how the costs of that are going to be shared, and that is sort of driving the nervousness at political level about making this a kind of a headline issue. But at the same time, as we know, when it comes to the European People's Party agenda, it is there as part of the kind of the competitiveness argument in a world that is decarbonising. And it is there in terms of the kind of the security agenda, our ability to control what energy and where we import it from in a European context. So I think in a way it would be sort of too quick to read these election results as saying that this is Europe voting against the continuation of the Green Deal. At the same time, I would expect that there is a risk of the kind of the knee-jerk reaction from political leaders to read the polls that way, given that we know that the next phase of the European Green Deal is going to be about some of the more politically sensitive areas in terms of the impact on individuals, small businesses, and so on, for electrification of transport, housing, energy efficiency, these things that people are going to kind of feel immediately in their pocket. Yeah, that's my sort of my take, that we're not going to see this as the headline of the next institutions looking at a pan-European level, but I would expect the effort to continue there. Clearly, getting majorities in Parliament are going to be harder because there are many of the parties on the far right that will be needed for the kind of the compromises to get majorities on legislation for the next phase of the Green Deal that are going to be sort of difficult to convince on this front. What do others of you think about that from national perspectives? Rafael, thank you.
Yeah, maybe let me start with the European level, then go to the German level. I think, you know, the European Greens election results are a sort of regression to the mean. 2019 was an exceptional year for them at the European level, at the German level, and now they're back to their sort of historical normal share of 10 to 12% in the European Parliament, and that goes for the German Greens as well. In the German context, certainly the Greens are associated most clearly with ambitious climate action, and given that they're part of the government and have been responsible in the form of Robert Habeck, the Vice Chancellor and Minister for the Economy and Climate Action, for many of the most ambitious, but also sort of hurting in terms of cost of living decisions that they justify taking by reference to the disastrous energy policies of the Grand Coalition under Angela Merkel, the dependence on Russian natural gas, Nord Stream 2, and so on and so forth. So clearly this was for them a response to this immediate crisis that Russia's full-scale invasion and the secondary effects it had on the energy security for Germany, but for Europe more broadly, has had. But voters don't seem to quite follow that logic, and that means that the Greens will need to think in Germany how they rephrase their actions to make them a bit more appealing to the broader electorate beyond their core of 12-14% of voters maybe, and to get them back to the polls. Their loss has been driven significantly by core electorate staying at home this election.
Thanks a lot. Okay, well, sorry, Celia, did you want to come in on this?
No, just to add to that, to say that the Greens in France have suffered also quite a really bad score, right above 5%, not even sure to be represented in the European Parliament if numbers were to change slightly. To be fair, they were never too high in the French context, but the Green agenda has been adapted very much either by the Socialist Party or by Renaissance as well, and had become part of the package of the energy transition. What I think is important is to see, as you pointed out, the green lash that the arrival of nationalists in mass represents, and the risk that putting in place the Green Deal and implementing the Green Deal having high social cost or imposing a tough political decision will be impeded by these nationalist MEPs. It will make it more difficult. And it matters because I think the rest of the world is watching. Europe has sort of made the promise that, implementing the Green Deal and implementing a green transition, an energy transition was possible, that, green growth was a reality. And unfortunately, if the rest of the world will take notice about this green lash, and if the will of Europe is shattered, you may expect to see other big developing economies or less mature economies start to say, well, you know, if the Europeans can do it, why should we do it? And so I think that's where this next commission should not just give up on implementing the Green Deal, and hopefully, as you said, Susi, you know, the PPE and S&D will continue on even with this tough, difficult job of doing the implementation, because it's a matter of credibility for Europe as well.
Thank you very much. So we're sort of running towards the end of time, but we have a question in the chat box about migration. And so I don't want to overlook that. We know, I see that Arturo is switching his microphone on. He knows where this question is going. To what extent is this vote that we've seen in overnight, the sort of the harbinger of an even tougher migration stance than we've seen so far in the EU project? And to what extent do you read this as being actually about migration as a core issue for voters?
No, regarding the question of migration was the second, I think, important topic in the electoral campaign after the economy, because the economy is the first one in Italy, but the second is migration. Meloni took up the migration issue by going to Tirana a few days before the election to reiterate in some way the agreements made with Edi Rama, with the Premier Edi Rama. The left declared that this was just demagogic agreements. So I think that regarding the question and talking about the European perspective, regarding the question of migration, I expect continuity with what the Commission has done so far. I believe that a little bit of transformism, oscillating between left and right, is to be expected in the Commission's new political policy line, I think. Also even before, because the right is now growing in the numbers in the parliament, and Meloni is one of the main leader that won the election. So in some way, I expect that this increase the capacity of Giorgia Meloni and the right in general to establish a political line, on to ask a strong political line on migration in general. And I think it remains migration one of the main topics for the right in general, from Germany to France, Italy, in Spain, and other part of Europe, also in the eastern of Europe.
Thank you very much indeed, Arturo. So I think it's very clear that this is not the end of the conversation. Lots of pieces are still moving in terms of the results settling down from last night. Lots of pieces still moving in terms of the next steps of the different political families as they digest this picture, and then lots of developments to follow in terms of the national context, including France, in terms of the way that this evolves. We're obviously going to keep talking at ECFR. We're also going to keep writing. Our colleagues have been putting up some links to already published pieces on the ECFR site relating to some of the issues that colleagues have been discussing. There's lots more up there. I can see there's a question that I missed that just came up at the end about Defence Commissioner. Rafael said a few words about that, but he and other colleagues have said a few more words about that if you go to our site and what this all means. That picture will be evolving over the next few weeks, so do keep an eye on ECFR. But it just remains for me to say thank you very much, first of all, to our amazing panelists, not only for getting up, but for stepping up in terms of great analysis so soon after the results have come in. And thank you all for joining us online as well this morning, and look forward to staying in touch. Have a good Monday.